Thanks for downloading this episode from Teachers Talk Radio. You can find the full schedule and listen back to all our shows at ttradio.org. Enjoy the podcast.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading. Introducing My New Term, the revolutionary technology application connecting schools and candidates directly. Whether you're a school seeking to streamline your recruitment process or a candidate searching for your next role in education, My New Term has the solution. Developed by a former teacher, the technology at My New Term now connects tens of thousands of candidates with schools every month by digitizing the recruitment process. As a candidate, you can search for jobs, set up recommended jobs, and save time by applying directly to schools via a standardized online process. No more completing manual and repetitive application forms. Employers can streamline processes and save time utilizing the leading applicant tracking system for schools and multi-academy trusts. Recruitment in education has been broken for too long. My New Term is on a mission to change just that. Visit mynewterm.com to learn more, search all the latest opportunities, or schedule a demo. My New Term, shaping the future of education recruitment.
Hello, good evening, everybody. Welcome to Teachers Talk Radio. Once again, with me every Monday evening, we talk all things education. And thank you very much to my regular listeners who may have clicked play back on this, maybe listening back to this. Thank you very much for clicking play. I'm sure this one's going to be really interesting. It's all about the alternative pension scheme from United Learning, a pension scheme that they have pitched as an alternative to the teachers' pension scheme. And it brought quite a big reaction online, not just online, actually, just in general. The unions have collectively condemned the alternative pensions scheme plan. They have all said this is a really bad idea. They've said that it undermines the teacher pension scheme, whereas United Learning are saying that this is going to incentivize more teachers to join the trust, but also to stay in the trust. To give you just the background and a few little details before we start moving on and introducing guests, the pension scheme that United Learning are proposing would increase their starting salaries from about 32,000 upwards towards 38,000. That's for outside London. In London, they would rise to around 45,000. So the pay increase is maybe £6,000 to £7,000. Maybe I think it may be £5,000 to £6,000 in London, but we're talking quite significant pay increases that starting teachers would start on. That's an important thing to differentiate. This is for starting teachers. So if you imagine like the average trust, I think, and I'm sure my guests can correct me on this later on, but I'm pretty sure the starting salary for an ECT is going to be 30,000 across the board. So United Learning already have a higher starting salary at 32,000, but this one would raise it again to 38,000. However, in exchange for that pay increase, you would opt out of the teachers' pension scheme. You would join the United Learning pension scheme, which would mean that you would make a lesser contribution. I think the employer would make also a lesser contribution in exchange for that pay rise. I think it's 10% rather than over 20% with the teachers' pension scheme. So it's an option, and one that has drawn, as I say, a lot of ire from unions. There's been a lot of reaction online to it. A lot of people upset. But also, many people, especially I've seen policymakers in particular, seem to be relatively in favour of this. I've seen a lot of policymakers around, various institutions and think tanks saying this is a good idea. So we're going to discuss it all this evening. And as always, I'm going to open up the floor to anybody who wants to call in and anybody who wants to get involved in the conversation. If you want to do that, you can just hit the little microphone icon in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, and you can get involved in the conversation that way. It might be a good idea from the off. I'm going to have Mark McCourt on, who is going to be sharing his thoughts on this. I've got Kevin Courtney as well, the former Joint General Secretary of the National Education Union, the NEU. And also later on at around 8 o'clock, I've hopefully got John Coles, the CEO of United Learning, coming on to share his explanation of this scheme and why he's proposed it as CEO of United Learning. So first things first, I'll just open up the floor hopefully to Mark. Mark, if you can unmute yourself bottom left.
Hi, Tom.
Good evening. How are you today?
I'm great. Yeah, how are you?
Now, Mark, you did a big charity walk recently, I noticed.
I did, yeah. I just
walked tell us briefly about your massive charity walk.
Yeah, I just walked from Land's End to John O'Groats to raise some money for Macmillan Cancer. My feet haven't yet recovered, but it was a fabulous thing to do.
When did you finish it?
22nd of May, and I still have injuries.
No way.
Yeah.
Oh, come on now. Come on.
No, my feet are still bandaged, honestly.
Fair play. All right, and that was just walking, not even running. Come on.
Just walking.
Right.
Yeah.
So, well, congratulations, Mark. That is a good achievement. So, let me ask you, Mark, because I've seen online that you have been a vehement defender of the alternative pension scheme from United Learning. So, tell us why.
Well, I'm not entirely sure that's accurate that I'm a vehement defender of this particular scheme. It looks like an interesting scheme. I'm very much a defender of teachers being really quite smart people who can make their own decisions about their financial planning. And it's always been possible to opt out of the teacher pension scheme. When I was a young teacher, I opted out. I didn't want to be in that. The TPS is a great scheme. You know, the employer contribution is extraordinary compared to what you can get in the private sector. But it doesn't necessarily mean it has to be for everyone. And it absolutely is not always the case that it's the best long-term investment for you. Pensions are great long-term investments, but if you're going to be a teacher your entire life and have a full year contribution every single year, all the way up to retirement, it's an absolutely excellent scheme. But perhaps you're not going to do that. And I just think that what United Learning are proposing here is a way of helping those 1 in 10 teachers, I think it is, who already opt out of the teacher pension scheme. Now, when you opt out, like I did when I was young, you get no employer contribution. So you take a really big hit to your investment pot. And it looks to me that what United Learning are doing is saying, okay, there are people opting out. There are very good reasons for opting out of the teacher pension scheme. If they're going to do that, let's at least have in place an alternative where they can still draw some employer contribution. And I think that that's a very sensible thing to do in a market where we are struggling to attract people into teaching, and people have lots and lots of options as graduates and workplaces they can go off into. So I think it's a clever idea that can help out people. You know, so just if I give you a concrete example of that, you know, when I was young in the 90s, I'm sitting in the teacher pension scheme, and I think, right, I'm going to opt out of that because it was really obvious to me that there was about to be an enormous explosion in the value of housing in the UK. So one thing you might want to do if you're 21, 22, 23 is you might want to reduce the length of a mortgage. You might want to overpay your mortgage. You might want to get on the housing ladder quicker than you might have been able to otherwise. Now, the return on that investment, assuming the markets are favorable at the time, the return on that investment is enormous. Similarly, the stock market over the last 20 years, stock market was forecast to be pretty gloomy, but has consistently given returns of about 10%. And then, of course, that compounds every year. So you could do really quite well out of those schemes as well. And I just think teachers are bright enough to make these decisions for themselves. And, it might be that you're in your early 20s and the thing you want to do at that moment is sort out getting on the housing ladder, for example, or sorting out an investment that you're particularly keen on. So a couple of years where you are paying less into a pension and more into a long-term investment can really pay dividends. If you're in your 20s, you haven't yet bought your first house, getting a LISA or LISA, however people prefer to say it, that's a tax-free way of buying your first house. Again, has enormous benefits. So yeah, I'm really supportive of smart people being independent and being able to make their own decisions about their own long-term financial planning.
Well, this is what Daniel Kebede, who's the General Secretary of the NEU, said. He said the framing of do teachers want more pension or more pay is completely backwards. Teachers want to be rewarded fairly for the difficult job they do. They want fair pay and they want to defer some of their earnings so they can live a dignified retirement. What they don't want is CEOs on in excess of 250,000 a year, running trusts with reserves in excess of £50 million, giving them the choice between hardship now or hardship in retirement. Let's call it for what it is, a flagrant attempt to undermine teachers' terms and conditions that will undermine the pension for the entire profession. Now, I wanted to ask you, Mark, on this point, the last point that he made. I mean, there's lots in there that he said, but the last point he made about undermining the teachers' pension scheme, because surely I understand it's taxpayer backed. I understand that from what I've read, and it seems complicated, but from what I've read, they're basically saying that it's guaranteed by taxpayer income, that regardless of what happens, the scheme is almost like rubber stamped from government. However, in other case studies, there have been examples where, things like this have happened and they've been eroded. And then obviously at some point they might say, well, only 30% or 40% of teachers are in the TPS, so let's get rid of it. Yeah. What surely that is a risk to a very good pension scheme that already exists by academies, in inverted commas, setting up their own gigs, so to speak.
Yeah, it's sure. Of course, it's a risk. I think the risk is pretty low. I think the uptake of this could be decent, but the risk of destabilizing the TPS because of it is low. The much bigger risk to destabilizing the TPS is the fact that, pensions are great investments, right? But the biggest risk to pensions, whether it's a defined pension like this, or whether it is a SIP or whatever it is, the biggest risk to pension is the fact that governments continuously interfere with pensions. Anyone that's my age will have been through several times where the retirement age was changed. The rules keep changing, going from 80th to 60th and so on. So that's by far the biggest risk. The UK government, at the moment, the thinking inside government for the last couple of years has been, well, look, there isn't a future. There really isn't a future where public service pensions are affordable, or indeed the state pension is affordable in the way that it's operated at the moment. So, government are looking at
but state isn't that pension. With in fairness though, isn't that why they've increased the contributions that teachers make to it to make it more viable?
Yeah, sure. So you're chucking for employers, chucking some more money at the moment is definitely helping out a little bit. But the long-term view of this,
they're putting more in as well, aren't they?
Yeah,
but teacher contributions have gone up by, I'm reading, between 7 and 11%.
Yeah, but the long-term view of government is, with these pensions and state pensions, is there the need to, for example, move towards an Australian system? In Australia, your state pension is means assessed, right? So if you have too much money, you just don't get the state pension and so on. So there's going to be an enormous structural change to the way in which national pensions are operated in the coming decades. We all know it. We all know that this thing, it's a house of cards, right? It can't just keep being built up like this. But some teachers opting out of the teacher pension and making some financial decisions in their 20s to accelerate certain other aspects of their life isn't the biggest threat. So I would be surprised if something like this initiative was to destabilize, even over decades, drip, drip, drip. I'd be surprised if this was a thing that destabilized the teacher pension scheme. But I understand the sentiment. I get that.
Yeah, I mean, the reason
people hear about this and worry.
Yeah, I mean, again, this is what some people say in inverted commas. We're going to have, Kevin Courtney on at some point this evening as well. But, there will be those who will say that it's selfish. There will be those who will say that, regardless of whether this looks shiny and looks good, they'd say that it's selfish to even gamble with the teacher pension scheme being as good as it currently is in the world of pensions. And also there's something else I read on there as well, is it's not just the benefits, the central benefits of the teacher pension scheme. There's also lots of fringe benefits, like it's index linked. Now, Mark, you can tell me what the hell that means, because I'm not an expert on pensions, but I believe it means that the value of the outlay of the pension goes up or down depending on inflation and the cost of goods when you get it.
Yeah, there is no doubt that the teacher pension scheme is one of the better pensions that exists, but it is not the best pension that exists, and it is not the best things that you could do with your money earning the kind of salaries that teachers earn. What's the average teacher salary nowadays? About 40,000 pounds, something like that. There are other things that you could do with your money over a period of 30, 40 years that will give you better returns. There are SIPs that you can jump into that allow you to choose the funds. I don't know about I don't work for United Learning, and I'm not here to defend United Learning. I just defend teacher choice. But I don't know about the pension that they're then going to provide, because one of the difficulties with private pensions, and I've employed thousands of people, one of the difficulties with private pensions is that nearly all private pensions, workplace pensions, go for the default fund, and nearly all workers, I think it's something like maybe 80 or 90% of all workers across the UK are in a default fund, which is a really low return fund. Whereas you could jump into a SIP and say, hey, I'm opting out of that and jumping into a higher return fund. So, saying to people, you might want to consider your future more carefully. You might want to play a much more active role in your future and your financial stability in the future. I think that's a good thing.
I mean, I guess, of course, we've talked about the risk of undermining the TPS, but I guess people would also say, well, what about the risk of the United Learning pension scheme crashing itself and not being secure, if that makes sense?
Yeah, of course.
Is that less secure than the teacher pension scheme, if you know what I mean?
Well, it's some private pensions are less secure. They're more volatile for people that like a bit of risk. When I'm saying most people in the country are in a default fund, these are low return, very, very, very secure pensions. That's why they give a low return. So yes, some pension funds have gone wrong in the past, but I don't know which one they're looking at. But I would be surprised if United Learning was looking at a high risk one and not a default fund. So I don't think there's much risk there. There is always risk to pensions, though. The fact that the government interferes with pensions all the time. What's the total contribution at the moment is something like £1 million max, which they brought down in the recent budget, and they're always moving that figure up and down. So pensions, although they are great financial instruments, they're not necessarily the best ones.
Tom, could I come in at that point?
Yeah, Kevin, I've just realised on my screen it says you're still a listener, so I do apologise. I've literally been staring at you thinking, are you there? And you actually have been there, so massive apologies.
Kevin, no
Kevin,
problem.
Please come in and tell us your views on this.
Well, thanks for inviting me. And I have to start by saying I fundamentally disagree with what Mark's been saying. Fundamentally disagree that the pension scheme, he was portraying the teacher pension scheme as something that's going to fall over in the next while, that nobody's going to carry on supporting these sorts of pension schemes. I think that's wrong. And Mark came close, I think, to giving financial advice. And I'd appeal to anybody listening to this not to take what Mark said as financial advice. The things that he was talking about leaving the pension scheme and you'll be rolling in money when you retire, that's not a safe thing to take from this call. I'm currently in receipt of my teacher pension, and it is absolutely one of the best things, one of the best parts of the terms and conditions of being a teacher. And no teacher should lightly give it up, and the profession shouldn't lightly give it up either. That what I'm really worried about with the ULT proposal, with John Coles's proposal, if it came in, if it works, three simple things. First of all, it is robbing Peter to pay Paul. It's taking money out of your pension income to give you money now. And the teacher pension scheme is much, much better than anything ULT will be able to provide. The teacher pension scheme is a defined benefit scheme. Despite the changes that have happened, it's still one of the very best pension schemes that you can get. Defined benefit. The ULT scheme will be defined contribution, so you'll put money in, but what you get out will absolutely depend on the state of the market when you retire. And if climate change has made the markets not work very well, you will get nothing from it. You know, there are risks attached with that. So that's my first problem, robbing Peter to pay Paul. Secondly, I think that this change could imperil the teacher pension scheme. If it worked, if people took it up, then less people paying into the pension scheme. The Treasury could look at that and say there's less people paying in. It wouldn't mean that people who've currently paid in would lose any of the benefits that they've accrued, but they could decide to turn it off for new teachers. That is a move they could make. So there is a threat to the teacher pension scheme if this happens. And my third point is that if this works, if you say we'll give 45,000 quid to people in London, now remember that's money taken from their retirement income. It's not John Cole's generosity. It's not come from the government. It's taken from your own pension income. But if that worked to get teachers, new people to come into the profession, then that would massively reduce the pressure on government for the pay rises that we actually need. So those are my three problems with it. Robbing Peter to pay Paul will imperil the pension scheme and reduces the pressure for the pay rises that we know we need. Daniel's absolutely right. The narrative is, the framing is wrong to say, do you want pay or pensions? We want both. That's the right place for the profession to be.
Mark, I'll give you a chance to say anything on that, whether you want to sort of take issue with any of that.
Yeah, I mean, just to start, Kevin, it's an unusual approach to dialogue to begin by wildly misrepresenting someone you're trying to have a polite conversation with. Now, I repeatedly said, I believe in teachers being smarter, making their own decisions. I don't know what I could say that would be further away from me saying, I'm not giving you advice and I'm not telling you what to do. I've got zero interest in telling anyone what to do or advising anyone. The point is, people can make these decisions for themselves, and I don't think that I or you or anyone has the moral position to say to them, you have to do what I want you to do. But I do appreciate, as I said when I was speaking, I do appreciate the concern. I appreciate the concern that such a great scheme, as I repeatedly said it was, could at some point in the future not be available to people. I'm simply saying that I think the bigger risk to that not being available is wider aspects of the economy and the future affordability of the state. So, you know, it's an unusual thing to start like that, Kevin, when I'm just trying to have a polite conversation with you.
Well, I'm sorry if you took it that way. I hope I've got a reputation for being somebody who's very happy to have pleasant conversations. But what I took you were saying, Mark, was you were suggesting to people that they could invest in these SIPs or in property and they might be better off. And so you weren't suggesting that to people as a route that they should take. I'm just saying to people they shouldn't take that as advice. If they want to think about leaving the pension scheme, they should certainly get an independent financial advisor, because I think that people would, the most often, they would be much worse off by leaving the teacher pension scheme.
Yeah, and just to be clear, what I was saying was, here are things that I did as a young teacher, and I don't regret doing them. If anyone wants financial advice, I know United Learning are thinking about giving their own financial advice. I'm not sure how that will work. Like I say, I'm not speaking for United Learning at all. But hopefully everybody's aware that everyone in any pension scheme in any part of the UK can 3 times throughout their career take from their scheme £500 tax-free to get specific financial advice. So, the government have a scheme there that allows anyone in the country to take financial advice. And if you're going to mess around with the stock market, if you're going to mess around with pensions or ISAs or anything like that, you really should do that first. It's a smart thing to do. What really, for me, is the issue here is that 1 in 10, I think I'm right on 1 in 10, I might be out of date, but I think it's 1 in 10 teachers already opt out and therefore get no employer contribution. And I think they're doing that. Some of them are doing it because, like me, they wanted to be investors, and some of them are doing that. Most of them are doing that because other things in your 20s are hard to afford, like getting on the housing ladder. So people are deciding not to pay their pension contribution so they can afford these other important things in their younger years. And we all get the pressures of that. Everyone knows how really difficult it is for anyone young to get a house at the moment or to start a family. We all understand those pressures and understand why people make those decisions. What I think is intriguing about the United Learning thing is here is a way where people could opt out but still get an employer contribution. So that's an interesting thing, I think, from my point of view.
Yeah, this is the problem, though. It is about 10%, not 10% of the teaching profession. The vast majority of teachers are in the pension scheme. But as you say, about 1 in 10 newly qualified teachers are not in the pension scheme. Some of them then join at the end of their first year or join at the end of the second year. But some of them have left the profession before they've joined. So there are about 10% of the cohort of people coming in who aren't in the pension scheme. But that has been going up as teacher pay has been held down compared with prices. And this is the problem that has to be addressed. And that's my point, that if this is the alternative, and if this gets people to come in, it actually reduces pressure for the teacher pay rise that I think we all know that we need.
I was wondering, Mark, on that point that Kevin's made, what is your response to that point? Because it is a reasonable point to make, isn't it? In terms of, would this undermine efforts to get a pay rise for teachers?
Well, I think we're about to see a significant pay rise coming, and not before time. From teacher pay point of view, it's an embarrassing starting salary. I'm retired now, but I've employed thousands of people in the private sector, and by the time I retired last year, there were people starting in my company who were 21 years old, graduates, and they wouldn't even apply if the salary was less than £50,000-60,000. And one of the things that strikes me is you've got all these options, all these places you could go. Why on earth would you go off to be a teacher? And pay is a big part of that in terms of recruitment. Retention is the bigger issue, I think. Pay is important, but less important there. Behavior, autonomy, professionalism becomes more important. But attracting people into the profession, the starting salary is just quite embarrassing when you look at what 21-year-olds are getting paid now.
Well, this is it. The university graduate average salaries, legal, £47,000. These are starting salaries. Average. Digital and IT, 33,000. Financial services, 33,000. Health, 31,000. Energy and engineering, 31,000. And then we've got retail, 32,000. So the starting salary is going to be 30, isn't it, for teachers? So, I know United Learning have 32, but
and it's not a bad thing that working in retail you get 32 grand. Great, it's a hard job. You should do.
But I think
but being a teacher is a hard job as well, and there needs to be a commensurate salary there. Teacher salaries are embarrassing.
Kevin, do you want to come in on that?
We absolutely agree about that. The teacher salary needs to be much higher, and in fact, it has to be, by comparison, even higher than it needed to be pre-pandemic, because so many other graduate careers now have working from home for a substantial part of the week, and people regard that as attractive, and that can obviously never be a substantial part of a teacher's role. And so there's going to have to be an even bigger increase for the market, for the market comparison, and we are starting to see that coming through. I mean, I do think that's a result of the industrial action that happened last year. The fact that the NEU showed that it could win a ballot again this year at Easter, that's made a real difference with the review bodies. But that takes us back to the point, though. You know, if I mean, ULT can only contemplate doing this, and there are some legal questions. It might not be legal. People are looking into that. But the only reason they can contemplate doing it is because of their academy status. So it would never have come up if we didn't have multi-academy trusts. It wouldn't be on the horizon now. So government would just have the pension scheme. That's what we need. We need them to be thinking about the pay rise, and this sleight of hand, taking money from your retirement income to give to you now, relieving the pressure. If that does relieve the pressure on teacher recruitment, it will relieve the pressure on the government to pay the profession properly. And that's, that's in many ways my biggest
Kevin,
concern
just to play
about
devil's advocate here, could you also say, though, that does that sort of, if you like, dumb down innovation? Does that stop academy chains or leadership within these institutions from innovating to find ways to give? And could you also argue that there's nothing wrong with giving choice to anybody within the marketplace to say, okay, I mean, in the private sector, that would be the usual thing, wouldn't it? You have a choice between different providers, you choose one, and that's it. I'm playing devil's advocate here. I'm not.
Yeah, no, I you know what you're saying, Tom. I hear that, and those are reasonable questions. They are the sorts of things that the policy people you were talking about earlier on, like Jonathan Simons, they are saying those sorts of things on Twitter. I fundamentally approve of innovation, thinking about how we best teach, etc. But I have to say that innovation of this sort around teacher terms and conditions, teacher pay, teacher pensions, will be used to drive down teacher wages. That has been the historic pattern in every sort of privatization that we've seen. My mother was a school cleaner, and she was one of the very first privatized. The private companies said they were more efficient than the state. It was a university she was working in cleaning. The private companies said they were more efficient than the state in doing the cleaning. But when you look into it, the way they are more efficient is by paying the workers less for more work. And that's what happened to my mother. And that's what will happen in this situation. The drive to compete is baked into this. And we should... And this is what Michael Gove wanted. The whole academy revolution, admittedly, started under Labour to match the sort of charter schools in the US. But in the US, charter schools are still a very small percentage of total schools. So Michael Gove's academy revolution, getting us to where we are now, he wanted to break up national pay and conditions for teachers. You might remember that in 2014, he wanted to remove all protections on teacher working time from the STPCD. He was knocked back on that, but he wanted to do that. He wanted to break up teacher pay and conditions. John Coles is taking a big step towards that. It will be the supreme irony if Michael Gove not having got it, if this now came in under a Labour government. So I do hope that Bridget Phillipson will take some sort of step to stop this happening.
Kevin, thank you very much for sharing your views. Feel free to stick around in the background if you want to come back in later on. And same to you, Mark, because in a second I'm going to introduce John Coles, the CEO of United Learning, who's joining us on Teachers Talk Radio to talk about this particular scheme, the alternative pension plan that is going to, I think, in the proposition stage. with United Learning. So, John, welcome to TTR. If you want to just unmute yourself in the bottom left-hand side. Hopefully, there you go.
Hello.
Welcome. How are you today?
Yeah, very well, thank you. I've just joined in with, heard a bit of Kevin, who seems to have lost the plot slightly, going off on a complete tangent.
Well, everybody on TTR is entitled to their views, and there will be many out there who agree with Kevin. You know, there will be many out there who feel sympathy for the things that Kevin is saying. What I want to ask you, John, to start with is on this. Oh, before I do ask you anything, John, let me give a shout out to our sponsors on the show this evening, John Catt Educational. If you are a teacher and if you want a professional development book, then please visit johncattbookshop.com and please use a 20% discount code brought to you by us at Teachers Talk Radio. Anybody can use it on however many books you want and you get 20% off. JCTTR2425. That's the code, JCTTR2425. Get 20% off any professional development book on the John Catt website, johncattbookshop.com. The other thing I want to do is I want to give a massive shout out to everybody listening live. People like Nat, people like Chloe, people like Rich, one of our regular TTR listeners, Mr. N, Rachel, Ben, other Ben. There's lots of Bens here. James, Jake, Chris, James. There's lots of James as well. I don't know why. But I want to give a massive shout out to everybody listening in live. Callum, Rebecca, Tom. So thank you for joining us. This will be available, of course, to listen back to as well. So, John,
It's the privatization of podcasting, Tom. It's an outrage.
Oh, hey. Listen, I want to ask you this, right? And I'll go back to what Daniel Kebede said, who is, as you'll know, the General Secretary of the NEU, right? And he was saying in his statement about this that United Learning have about £50 million in the bank. And to quote him, he said the CEO is paid over 250k. He said that there's no need for United Learning to disrupt the teacher pension scheme in the way that he says they are. What would you say to him?
Well, what I have said to him is it doesn't disrupt the teacher's pension scheme at all. It just gives anybody who wants to come and teach in our schools an additional choice. The additional choice doesn't cost us less. So the idea that this is cost saving, as he implies, is just wrong. And the idea that we're disrupting anything is also wrong. We're giving a chance for people to take more of their remuneration in pay and less in pension. So it's a very straightforward argument, I think. It's not, as Kevin's implying, taking apart teachers' pay and conditions or changing people's entitlement to pensions or saving money. It's not privatisation. It's quite simply giving people who want to have more of their remuneration as pay and less as pension the opportunity to do that. And
is that an inducement, though, John? Is that an inducement? The extra pay?
An inducement to what? An inducement to join.
An inducement to take out the United Learning Scheme rather than enter the TPS.
No, we're completely neutral on what teachers choose to do. We don't mind whether teachers want to keep their current terms and conditions. If they want to do that, that's fine. That will always be available to current staff, to future staff. And so people who want that traditional offer can have it. And, you know, we already pay teachers about 9% more than national pay and conditions. So we aren't following national pay and conditions because we pay people more.
John, can you talk us through, can you just briefly, before we get into it more, can you talk us through what United Learning offer as it stands as pay for new teachers as a salary, and then talk us through what this proposal entails in detail from a financial point of view?
Yeah. So our starting salary nationally is 32,850 plus TPS, obviously. In London, it's 39,000. What this would mean is that you could decide to take some of your a greater amount of your remuneration as pay and and less as pension. So the extreme, the sort of lowest pension that we'd pay is 10% of salary, and if you went for that option, you'd have a 15% pay rise. So outside London, that would mean you'd be paid about 38,000 and have 10% pension contributions into a defined contribution pension scheme. In London, you'd be paid about 45,000 and have a 10% contribution into a defined contribution scheme. And you don't have to make employee contributions unless you want to. If you want to, you can. At the rate of 0, so in other words, at 0, 5 or 10%, you can make employee contributions. If you went for maximum pay, so 0% employee contributions, 10% employer contributions, then you could benefit from up to a 25% increase in your take-home pay. And to give you another example of that from further up the pay scale, if you're paid £45,000 as a teacher, it costs your employer now £63,000 to employ you. And if you have no student loan, in all of these examples, if you have no student loan, you would take home about 32,000 of that 63,000. In other words, you take home about half. On our model, you could, for exactly the same cost to us, be taking home about £40,000 of that £63,000. And but the choice is yours. And I think the important thing from our point of view is that it is a choice. Nobody is pushed one way or the other, because it doesn't actually make any difference to us which people prefer, except that, we hope will attract more people into teaching, because we've got an urgent need to attract more people into teaching. And we'll give people who are current teachers and current members of TPS the opportunity to get independent financial advice. So, we trust people to make their own decisions, but we're also making sure that people are well informed and they've got an opportunity to get that independent advice. And we think this will be very attractive to some people who aren't currently teachers, because, in the graduate labour market, very good graduates are going to private sector employers, and perhaps they're getting paid, rather more than the teacher starting salary, £35,000 to £40,000. But typically, those private sector employers are paying the minimum legal level of employer pension contributions, about 3%. So those people coming to us to teach potentially get a pay rise and potentially get better pension provision as well than they would in a private sector employer where they may be choosing to go at the moment. We desperately need, as a teaching profession, to attract more of those people. I think we're paying enough in total remuneration to outcompete a lot of those private sector employers and to give people an opportunity to be part of the best profession in the world, while still being able to have the same standard of living or better than they would in those private sector jobs. So that's the proposition, really. I think it's a great option for people who want it, and being a teacher under the traditional terms and conditions is a great option for people who want that. So it's a choice.
It is a choice, John, but there will be many out there who will say that this is going to disrupt the teachers' pension scheme. So there are many out there who will be concerned that by introducing an offer like this, other academy chains or institutions will follow your lead as the biggest one in the country. If it's successful, which many people predict it could be, then suddenly the numbers of people in the TPS drop to lower than 50%. Let's imagine they end up with 30%, 40% in the TPS. And then suddenly, the government or whoever it is turn around and say, do you know what? With only 30 to 40% in the TPS, let's get rid of the TPS. Let's just let private equity firms compete for teachers' pension, compete. Now, surely you understand those concerns.
I just think that's completely misplaced. That's not how pension schemes work at all. I mean, firstly, everyone who's in the teachers' pension scheme, ought to understand that it's an unfunded scheme. It's a scheme where there isn't a fund. There hasn't been a build-up of assets. There's literally no asset to back people's pensions. What backs people's pensions is a taxpayer commitment to pay those pensions. So it's a very unusual arrangement, but although it isn't counted as part of the national debt, that teacher pension liability is effectively part of the national debt. And the reason why it's completely secure is because the taxpayer is committed to meeting that that liability in the long run. So the idea that, you know, a few people coming out of it, or even a lot of people come, I mean, the unions have made it much more likely that other people will pick it up by making it quite so prominent in a way which has totally surprised us. But even if lots of people come out, which I frankly don't think is likely, it doesn't disrupt or disturb anything about the teachers' pension scheme. And if there are fewer people in it, then yes, there are fewer contributions going into the Treasury, but equally the liability is not increasing. So the debt that the taxpayer owes to future teachers is not growing at the same rate. And in all sorts of ways, that, you know, can be argued to make it more sustainable, not less sustainable. I think a great deal of this is simply not right. The suggestion that it's destabilizing something. You know, if there are fewer people building up a long-term liability, well, that's easier for the taxpayer to meet, not harder.
Just to quote, this was in Schools Week just today, actually. Several lawyers were talking about this, and one of them said, the TPS is an unfunded scheme, which means the difference between the money paid out by the pension scheme to retirees and the money coming into the pension scheme in contributions from working teachers is actually made up by the taxpayer, as you've just said. In common with most mature defined benefit schemes, the contributions to TPS are now lower than the payments to retired members. In March 2016, the TPS was assessed to be £22 billion in deficit, which led to schools' contribution rates rising substantially, which they've obviously now more than doubled since 2012. So I think it's something, well, as you mentioned earlier, John, I think it's something like 27% or something that is the employer contribution on the teacher's pension. The reduction in TPS membership would increase the taxpayer support needed in the short term to prop up the deficit, which could cause difficulties for the new government facing lots of spending pressures. Again, would you agree with that? I mean, like, taxpayers will have to cover it, or the government will have to find money to plug the gap, won't they? Or, again, and they're saying that, I guess this can't, I'm not sure if this can happen or not, the whole thing collapses in the long term.
I don't agree with that, actually, on several grounds. Firstly, this assessment that it's £22 billion in deficit is a completely notional assessment. So there are public sector pension schemes. The local government pension scheme is one, the university's superannuation scheme is another, which are funded schemes. And it's possible to do a meaningful valuation of funded schemes because you've got a pot, you know, there's a big financial asset sitting there, and you can assess actuarially, is the asset big enough to meet the future liabilities? And of course, you know, these things are based on assumptions, but you are basically trying to assess a known liability against a known asset, and you've got a valid valuation there. What's happened with LGPS and USS over recent years is that they've swung wildly from deficit a few years ago to surplus now because interest rates have gone up, and interest rates act as a discount rate, so-called, for pension liabilities in the future. What's happened with the TPS is completely the opposite of that, because the government has introduced something called the SCAPE rate, which is effectively the discount rate for unfunded pension schemes. SCAPE standing for superannuation contributions adjusted for prior earnings. And the SCAPE rate was introduced in 2011 as a way of valuing unfunded schemes, and it was set then at CPI plus 3%. And it's decreased twice since then. It's now sitting at CPI plus 1.7%. And so these things are created as a stroke of the pen in Treasury the Treasury has just decided to cut the discount rate sharply in relation to unfunded schemes. And that is really what's driving the increased employer contribution rate. And this is why public sector unfunded schemes have just got a lot more expensive at the time that all of the funded schemes have swung from deficit into surplus. So this situation of a notional deficit isn't based on reality or anything that's happening in the wider financial world. It's the stroke of a pen in Treasury that has created that situation. And the impact of that on schools, trusts, local authorities is that instead of paying 14% in employer contributions for teachers' pensions, we're paying 28.6%. And, in the 12 years I've been doing this job, that cost of the teachers' pension scheme has more than doubled to employers at a time when teachers' pay has not been going up at all. In fact,
but there will be those who will say, John, that United Learning aren't short of money. So there'll be those who'll say, well, can't United Learning just do what other academies and schools are doing and do what they want to do, increase the salaries, but also just keep the TPS?
Oh, well, we have done that. We've increased the salaries.
Introduced the new scheme. I'm saying just give another pay rise, which is admirable that United Learning currently offer more than the starting salary anyway. But using the reserves of cash the UL have, do they have to introduce this scheme? Can't they, by asking teachers to do it? Couldn't UL just do increase salaries?
But just to be clear, just to say again, we're not doing this as a cost-saving measure. It isn't saving us money. In fact, the reality is it will cost us money, because a key group who I think almost certainly will take up this scheme are the 10% of staff under 40 who aren't currently in our trust, who aren't currently a member of any pension scheme, because they're being priced out by the TPS, which requires them, at our starting salaries, to be paying at least 8.6% of their salary into TPS as a contribution. And they are missing out hugely on a large part of their remuneration simply because they feel they can't afford to be in TPS. So the reality is that doing this is going to cost us money. But what it's also going to do, we believe, is attract some people into the profession. And I think that's a hugely advantageous thing, not just for us, but for every school in the country. If we could attract, 300 or 400 of the government's target of 6,500, teachers, and if they're in shortage subjects, well, that's 300 or 400 more teachers of shortage subjects in the country as a whole. It's not something which only benefits us. It benefits labour supply for all schools in the country. And so I think far from it being a negative thing for other schools, it's a hugely positive thing, if we can manage to attract more people into the profession.
Does this get the government off the hook, though, in the sense that, Kevin Courtney was on just before you, and he was saying that the unions have been, pressurising for increases in teacher salaries, increases in teacher pay, and this almost takes the pressure off the government to actually up teacher salaries, because they're going, oh, these academy chains will do it for us. They'll, basically start their own pension schemes, devalue TPS, and then we don't have to increase salaries because they'll opt out of TPS and go into these other schemes. And, one of the things, that's what Kevin Courtney was saying, not what I'm saying.
Yeah. Firstly, nothing about it devalues TPS. I mean, TPS, and I've been clear in everything I've ever said about this. TPS is an excellent scheme. It's got great benefits, and I've got nothing against TPS whatsoever. And, for teachers who want to be in TPS, excellent. And I have no objection whatsoever to that. Does it let the government off the hook? Well, there's a risk that is the sort of analysis which, is sometimes associated with a kind of Marxist economist, which is, you shouldn't do anything to ameliorate the effects of capitalism because that'll prevent the revolution coming. And that is not a good basis for running a school system when every day there are children who are being taught by teachers, who are working extremely hard, but covering subjects that they aren't expert in, where schools have vacancies across a lot of shortage subjects. I think it's our duty as people who are responsible and accountable for the education of children to do everything we can to attract the very best people into the teaching profession now, for the children who are in schools now, who only get one chance at it. And an argument, if this was the argument, that we should do nothing to make things better now because that'll take the pressure off, a future teachers' pay settlement, I really couldn't disagree with more. We must act now, and we're irresponsible as employers if we don't do all we can to attract in the very best teachers we can.
John, is the United Learning pension scheme index linked?
It's a defined contribution scheme. And so the way defined contribution schemes work is that you put in a set amount of money. And by the way, I should say, because people keep saying, well, I'm in a public sector pension scheme. I'm not in a public sector pension scheme. I'm in a pension scheme just like this. It's a defined contribution scheme, because I don't think I'm eligible for any public sector pension schemes. And I've never been a member of the TPS, incidentally. So everybody who's having a go at me about that is not right. But the way a defined contribution scheme works is that you put a proportion of your salary, which could be big or small, as I say, for a lot of private sector employers, it's 3% of salary, which is the legal minimum. That is invested for you, and typically, employers, have a scheme with one of the big pension firms around on the market. Your sort of Legal and Generals and Avivas and those kind of people. You invest your money in a scheme, and you have a pot, and it's your pot, and it grows, or can of course shrink, but it grows with investment, and you choose to some degree what sort of investment you want to make. There's a default setting which every employer will have, and you come to retirement age with a pot, and it's not index linked. It's invested. And that is the model. So,
because the only reason I mention that is Linda Wallace, who's director of Wesleyan Financial Services. She said a major advantage of being in the TPS is index linked, and this helps to protect it from future increases in the cost of living and guarantees retirement income that is directly linked to a teacher's salary. Any pension alternative that teachers might look to replace it with is likely to be far less generous. That's what she said.
Yeah, and direct benefit schemes can work in a range of ways, but typically, in public sector schemes, a proportion of your salary is essentially put away each year, and it grows at a rate which is defined in the scheme, normally CPI plus a percentage. And at the end of so this is a so-called career average scheme. At the end of your career, you've built that up year after year after year. And, that gives you a defined benefit, which is why the scheme is called that. So, and it's a very advantageous form of pension scheme. It's the way public sector schemes all used to work in a slightly different way, and there are still some teachers who are on a final salary, so-called scheme, which your pension is determined according to how much you're paid at the end of your career. So these defined benefit schemes don't really exist in the private sector anymore. Extremely unusual. They really only exist in public sector pension schemes. They are a very good pension scheme. They're also extremely expensive. And, that's why the opportunity exists for people to say, okay, I will have less pension and I'll have more pay now. Because, look, for people of my age or Kevin's age, if you could afford to buy a house and you could afford to live and you could go through your career comfortably and, retire on a defined benefit scheme, well, excellent. Of course, that's, in all sorts of ways, an ideal situation for a public sector worker. But if you're currently a young professional in London, and this isn't just true of teachers, this is true of many other professions, all other professions really, except the very highest paid. Actually, it's extremely expensive to live, and the cost of renting a flat, let alone buying a house, is prohibitive for a lot of people. And I think we are losing people who'd love to be teachers because it's the most important job in the world, and it's a great job. And there are people who would want to do it but think, I can't afford to do that. Particularly, people living in London or big metropolitan areas, the southeast, Greater Manchester, and so on. And we're losing those people. And they're not going for a better pension, they're going for a better salary. And the reason they're doing that is because that enables them to live, to afford housing, hopefully to save up for a deposit, eventually to afford a home of their own. And, the extra money that people could get from this option, for some people, not for everybody, but for some people, could mean that they could afford to get on the housing ladder, so that they get to retirement with a very valuable home. Yes, a lower pension, but I don't think that's an irrational choice for people to make. And it's perfectly reasonable, and I think right, for employers to allow people to have that choice. What is right for me in my personal circumstances.
Although, on the pension regulator's website, it does say it's important that any entitled worker's decision to opt out of or leave their current pension scheme should be taken freely and without being influenced by the employer. Would you say, by highlighting all these different great things about the alternative scheme, that is, in a way, influencing employers?
Influencing employers
sorry, not influencing employers, influencing employees.
No, because I don't mind what people do. I'm just saying that it's a perfectly rational choice in some circumstances to do this. And we will provide people, who are thinking about taking that choice, we'll provide them with access to an independent financial advisor, which we'll pay for. And then, they'll be properly informed before they make a choice. And then they're free to make whichever choice they prefer. And I mean, to say again, either is fine by us. We want great teachers working in our schools, and we want them to be able to make financial choices which are right for them. And if having this option attracts some people into teaching who wouldn't otherwise be there, that is good for everybody. That's not a cost to anybody.
Just circling back, John, was it you who came up with this idea? Where did this idea spring from and emanate from?
Yes, but basically it was me.
Great. And was it, when you were coming up with the idea, what, were you thinking widely about, okay, how can we get more teachers into UL, or was it, what were the considerations when you were coming up with the idea? What were the aims and the goals?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, we were much more focused in thinking about it on our, ability to attract in a group of people who aren't currently coming to teach. And to be honest, it was a bit influenced by my daughter's experience, who's, recently, a pretty new graduate who's in London and, has made choices which, are as I describe, and talking to her and her friends, very similar. People are concerned about earning enough to be able to live, the extraordinary cost of rent and housing in London for young people, which, people who have their own homes, fine. But, that's not the life that, young professionals and recent graduates are living at the moment. And so they're, looking to obviously do well in their careers and progress and develop and learn, but much, much more conscious about headline salary and being able to afford to live than about pensions. And overwhelmingly, people with really good jobs have really bad pensions in the private sector. And so, there's an opportunity there to attract in some people who I think were great in the classroom, but aren't thinking about it at the moment because they think it's a sort of lower paid occupation.
What did your daughter say, John, out of interest, about this idea?
Well, I haven't gone into it in detail with her. It was, just that my thinking was influenced by her experience, I think, rather than. I'm certainly not going to blame anybody else for it. Yeah.
Listen, John, absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on. It's really, really interesting to hear your perspective on it. Really appreciate you fielding those questions. So that's absolutely fantastic. So listen, if you need to go, please do. I know we said 30 minutes, so if you need to go, that's absolutely fine. We're going to carry on this conversation now for a little bit and invite anybody else who wants to get involved in it to call in. If you have an opinion on this, because that's what we're all about here, is hearing from different people, different viewpoints. So if you have a view on this, then or even just some expertise maybe on it or something to share, then you can hit the icon in the bottom left, the little blue microphone icon, and you can request in to speak. Do you think this is a good idea, a bad idea, or somewhere in between? Please let us know. Get in touch. The other thing you can do, if you don't want to do that, you can tweet us. In the bottom right hand corner, you'll see a little speech bubble. If you click that, you can put a tweet in there and tell us what you think. John, I'll just read out this comment to you so you can sort of field the first one we've had in. This is from Secret Class Teacher. They say, how is it ever positive to reduce pensions? It's arrogant to think it is. If the TPS is excellent, then why offer something that's not as good? Just pay the higher wages and the TPS.
I mean, there's nobody in the country. Look, we already pay, as I've described, more than anybody else. I think it is literally true that we pay more than any other employer in the state sector. But there's a limit to how much we can pay because we only get the same funding as everybody else. So, look, we've managed to do that because we run a whole lot of things extremely efficiently, and that saves money that we're able to put back into education and teaching because our back office is very tight and very efficient. But you can't save enough money to just keep doing that. There comes a limit to how much you can increase pay. So I don't think there's anything arrogant about offering people a choice. In fact, to be honest, I think it's pretty arrogant to say that people shouldn't have a choice. And it's pretty extraordinary to argue that teachers aren't capable of making their own choice in their own interest. I mean, if somebody's running huge credit card bills and constantly paying 16 or 17% on a couple of £1,000 of credit card balance, then the reality is that if they can clear that, that probably is the best financial decision they can make. And so it's pretty arrogant for somebody to say, well, we shouldn't offer people an option, which might, in fact, be heavily financially advantageous to them on the grounds that, somebody else has decided that something, that a particular pension choice has to be the best one or the right one for everyone. And, so our position is pretty straightforward. We're not encouraging anybody to do anything. We've designed these two schemes to cost the same. They just have a different balance between pay and pension. And if you prefer the current situation, the current traditional model, great. It's there. It always will be there. If having the alternative makes teaching much more attractive to you and you come and teach as a result, well, that's great for everybody as well. And I don't think, I don't think we can be accused of arrogance for suggesting that other people could have a choice.
Daniel Cabody said, young teachers are right to want more pay, but the choice should not be hardship now or hardship in retirement. We have zero chance of solving the recruitment and retention crisis through such measures. And he also said, I hope Bridget Phillipson takes note. I mean, what would you say to Bridget Phillipson now if she was on this call?
Well, I'm not sure I would need to say anything to Bridget Phillipson because,
she's under pressure, isn't she, from the unions to stop this?
I mean, I think every employer should be accountable for doing the best job they can to get the best teachers they can in front of children. We are highly accountable for how good our schools are and how well children do, as we should be. And it's a good thing if we have the ability to innovate, to attract more people into teaching. I think Daniel Kebede needs to be slightly careful in talking about a choice between hardship now and hardship in the future. Our starting salary at 32,850 is roughly equivalent to the median salary outside London. So our starting salary outside London is roughly the same as the median salary of all workers outside London. And calling that hardship wages, I think is fairly sort of disparaging to the average person in the country. And offering people, £38,000 and a 10% pension contribution, that is not hardship pension offering in a world where a sort of large proportion of workers who are in the private sector are offered only 3% employer contributions for their salary. So I don't think that's a fair characterization of the position at all. It's simply offering people a choice. And a starting salary of £45,000 in a London plus 10% pension, that's not heading for hardship in retirement as compared to the average worker. And I think also people just need to be slightly careful not to judge what other people's family circumstances may be. There are plenty of people working who have a partner or spouse who's also a teacher or otherwise working in public sector roles. It's perfectly rational, for example, for a couple to think, well, one of us will be in a public sector pension scheme and one of us will be paid more now, for example. These are all choices that people can perfectly reasonably be offered. People know their own personal circumstances. Somebody might think, right, I've got 2 children in childcare at the moment. For the next 3 years, whilst that's the case, I'm going to take more pay and less pension. But after that, I'll go back to less pay and more pension. Or they might be thinking, well, the chances are, given the way my career is going, I'll get another promotion in the next few years. In the medium term, I'm definitely going back into TPS. But right now, until I get that promotion, I'd rather have more pay, and I'll increase my contributions later. There are all sorts of choices that people in their own personal circumstances might perfectly reasonably want to make, either for the long term or in the short term. And as long as they're well informed, I can't see why anybody else should say, they shouldn't have the right to do that.
Ian Thomas, who's a director at Moore Kingston Smith Financial Advisors, said that for trusts to comply with regulations, state teachers who opt out must be re-enrolled every 3 years unless exemptions apply. So while this might not affect teachers, it would clearly be an administrative task that United Learning must adhere to. So are you going to do that every 3 years?
Well, we've said that people can change every year if they want to, and we don't see that as a problem. We already do auto-enroll everybody, and we'll carry on auto-enrolling. We don't think it's problematic. I know some people have suggested that it's unrealistic to think people can swap pension schemes every year. It isn't unrealistic. I can tell you there are people who are highly paid in the education sector who come in and out of the TPS every year, that they stay in the TPS until their contributions would trigger a tax threshold and then come out, and they're not back in again. And actually, that's quite common. Lots of people do it. And it's just simply doable. There's no obstacle to doing that.
We've got two more comments. One is a positive and one is a negative, John, if you want to hear them. We've got
Sure.
Andrew, who said, for teachers, it's a short-term gain for a long-term loss. It's just kicking the can down the road. What is needed is an increase in teacher pay. £32,850 is hardship wages given the current cost of living. And he's also said that he notices that John hasn't confirmed or denied his £200,000 wages. Also, we have Mike Buchanan, who said, I hope people will see this as giving teachers choice, which they do not currently enjoy, and greater control. Both are important and positive. So there you go, John. You've got a few. To be fair, there's been a lot of people out there who have given positive voice to this. Jonathan Simmons, I saw him say this is a great idea. I've seen other people say, this is positive. So it's not, there is a big kickback. There are also voices out there who are saying, maybe this is the way forward. But certainly there's concern, isn't there, John? I mean, we can't deny that.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because there was a big, obviously, union reaction, some of which honestly wasn't accurate in some of the things that were being said. I think people were concerned that this would be compulsory in some way, and I think people were concerned that it was being done to save money. And I think that as neither of those things is true, people feel reassured by that.
I think there was a point Kevin made, John, about Michael Gove and the fact that his master plan was really to break up teachers' pay and conditions, to academise everything, privatise everything, free choice, free markets, etc., etc. And there's some out there who will sit there and say this is just part of a master plan to privatise, to sort of let the market forces into the public sector, into the teaching profession, by a gradual means, and it will erode teacher conditions in the long run. That's what that's what Kevin said earlier. I'm sure there's others who would say the same.
Well, I mean, I've got no idea what Michael Gove thinks. He's not even an MP anymore. So the idea that this is a sort of Michael Gove conspiracy is pretty extraordinary.
Well, he still has influence, though, to be fair, doesn't he, in terms of his philosophy? I mean, he's been very influential on education. I very
much doubt anybody in the current government is much influenced by Michael Gove. So I thought this was some kind of irrelevant person from the past. It's got nothing whatsoever to do with him or the last government. It's simply that it is a good thing if we do things to make teaching more competitive. It's got nothing to do with privatisation. It's got a lot to do with competing for the best people in the country, the best new graduates to join us in educating the next generation. And frankly, a labour market, a more effectively functioning labour market, would mean that teachers' pay would go up. I mean, the School Teachers Review Body is quite straightforwardly a mechanism for holding down teachers' pay. That is pretty straightforwardly its purpose. And, there's no doubt that in a freer labour market, teachers' pay would drift up, not down. Which is why we're paying teachers more, because we can. And it's why we're offering this opportunity for people who want this mix of pay and pension to come into the sector.
I'm going to let
nothing about that. It erodes anybody's pay and conditions. It's quite the opposite.
I'm going to let Mark McCourt, who's been with us since the beginning, pose the final question to you, John, or the final statement. Just before he does that, which he's not prepared to do, by the way, I've just put him on the spot. I'm going to give a shout out to John Catt again, who are our wonderful sponsors on the show tonight. We love privatisation here at Teachers Talk Radio, as John mentioned earlier on. They are our wonderful publisher sponsors. So if you want to get a professional development book from any publisher in this country, make it John Catt and get a 20% discount on us. Use the code JCTTR2425 at checkout. You can put as many books as you want in your basket and still get the 20% discount. Forget about employer contributions. Make your own contribution to your own professional development today. Get on the John Catt website, johncattbookshop.com. Do it. Mark, do you want to have your final little point or question that you'd like to ask John?
Well, it's lucky you did that big lead in, Tom, so I could stop eating.
Well, I did that tactically, you see, just in case.
Yeah, it's very interesting listening to John. Obviously, I'd expressed many of the same views at the start of the show. I suppose one thing that you did actually say, John, but I would like it to come across a lot stronger as well. There is, for young teachers, the aspect of being forced into a situation because of affordability of buying houses and so on, which I mentioned at the start. But I think it'd be really useful for us to more strongly position the fact that teachers are really smart and they can think out the future and they can think about their financial decisions and their planning. So yes, whereas a lot of teachers in this situation opt out of the teacher pension because they want to get on the housing ladder or whatever, there are teachers, as I mentioned, when I was young, I did it. There are teachers who do it for very smart reasons. They're doing it because they're planning their future. And I imagine that across United Learning, across the system, you'll have loads of smart people that are thinking, oh yeah, actually, I can make my money work harder in this particular way for my particular circumstances. So it's not really a question, but I just think it's something we should shout louder about, that smart people should be allowed to make their own decisions, not just because they're forced into it, but because they know what they're doing.
You don't have to agree with Mark, John.
No, well, I mean, obviously, I do agree with Mark on that. I mean, yeah, I am aware that there are teachers who've thought very hard about their choices and their finances, and there are also teachers, quite reasonably, who've never thought about pension because they've joined the TPS, and that's fine. I am conscious, therefore, that there may be people who think, okay, that sounds an interesting offer, but I don't know anything about it and I don't know what the consequences are. And for those people, we think it is important that they should have access to independent financial advice, which is why we will pay for them to have access to an independent financial advisor. Because, I mean, I do agree with Mark, people can be trusted to make their own decisions, and people are smart and capable, and everybody's circumstances, will be different, and we can't just generalize. But it's also true that not everybody's thought very hard about pension choices, and particularly if you go into teaching and join the TPS, you may not have needed to, and so. I hope offering people access to an independent financial advisor is not seen as, implying that people aren't smart, but it is true, I think, that some people, haven't ever had to sort of inform themselves very much about pensions and pension planning. And so that's why we're saying people should have access to a financial advisor anyway.
Although, to say to both of you, and Mark, you've brought this up, so it's to you as well, is you've mentioned this idea of getting on the housing market and all the rest of it. Again, though, to go back to Linda Wallace, who's Director of Wesleyan Financial Services, she said any pension alternative that teachers might look to replace the TPS with is likely to be far less generous. That's what she said. She's a financial expert.
Yes, and it is simply true that pensions are very good financial instruments for long-term investment. It's absolutely the case. Pensions are good instruments. But if you are 70 years old and you still have to, for the rest of your life, pay rent because you were never able to get on the housing ladder, and you're 70 years old and you've got a slightly less generous pension, but you own the asset that you live in, there's a lot to be said about that, So yes, if you compare it directly to following the stock market, following ISAs, ISA, you'll end up about roughly 7% down, but you won't be taxed on that income, so you will be getting more income out of a teacher's pension, but you'll be getting taxed on it, even though you get relief at source. It's not as straightforward as saying any alternative to pensions is not going to be as good. It's just not true.
No, that's not what she said.
There are lots of alternatives that are.
She was saying any pension alternative to the teacher's pension. She was talking specifically that any other pension other than the teacher's pension.
I mean,
I
I think,
I get that. And the one thing about the particular scheme that John is offering at United Learning, if you took if I get this wrong, tell me, John, but I think you can take 10% employer and 0% employee. If you offered that in the private sector right now, if I offered that in the private sector, people would bite my hands off for that. That alone, nowhere near as generous as the teacher pension scheme, but that alone is a bloody good pension.
I think also, I mean, people in this need to be very careful not to get into offering individual financial advice. Because the choice isn't this pension or that pension. The choice is, this pension or that combination of pay and pension. And people's financial circumstances will be sharply different from one another, which will mean that the right choice for an individual, won't be the same for every individual. And, just saying in blanket terms, one option is always better than the other, I mean, simply isn't right and won't ever be right. So I think everybody has to be very, very careful here that, the reason why independent financial advisors exist is that everybody's individual circumstances differ and have to be assessed on their own merits. So that's an important piece of this. That sort of blanket statement, I don't think is very helpful, really.
Someone's asked, Mark, you might know the answer to this. Someone's asked, I've always thought the TPS is because many teachers simply won't last working until they're 60s. How would retiring early or going part-time at age 55 affect people's pension pot at retirement age? I don't know the answer to that. Does anyone know the answer to that? I don't.
Well, if it depends how old you are. It depends when your contributions were made, your length of service. The best answer to that is, if you are a teacher and you're in the TPS, you can log into the Teacher Pensions website and see your illustrations there.
Yeah.
Because it's very personal. If you're deciding to take lump sum, that can push you into strange tax territories about continuing to contribute to pensions after age 55 and so on. So the things to go and look at it. One point about that, though, is that it is true that a lot of people who set out to be a teacher for life don't stay in the profession all the way through because it's an exhausting job. But it's also true that a lot of people are teaching for a period of their life knowingly. A lot of people know I'm going to teach for 5 years or 10 years and then I'm going to do something else. And again, that's a unique circumstance where the TPS might not be the thing you want to go for. So,
James Martin has said, and this is for John, he said, aside from being poorer in retirement, it's almost certainly true that the proposed TPS alternative will not have ill health retirement that matches TPS as part of its benefits. And that was one of the concerns I've heard from people, is the fringe benefits, the wraparound benefits, it being index linked, it having the ill health retirement benefit. And he says it's highly dangerous given how many teachers end up needing ill health retirement. And he says it's shameful from United Learning. His words, not mine. John, any thoughts?
Well, he's just made something up which is untrue. Because
it might be. I don't know. I'm just quoting.
I know. Well, no, of course you don't, and nor does anybody else, because nobody's ever asked. So he's just invented his own facts, which aren't correct.
Tell us.
There will be benefits designed. They can't be identical to teachers' pension scheme benefits because of the way the TPS is, but there is going to be a death in service benefit, and there is going to be an ill health retirement benefit. And we're constructing those to be as similar as they can be, given that it's a very different type of pension scheme to the TPS. So I'm afraid somebody's decided to make something up and criticize us for it, which just isn't right. We have thought about that, and there will be provision for it.
Listen, we could talk all evening about this. It's been fascinating and interesting, and I'm sure it's not over. I think this is going to play out over. I mean, when is this going to be introduced, John? If all goes to plan, when are you hoping to introduce this thing?
Well, the plan is to consult through the autumn term and introduce in 25. 2025. And, you know, I mean, one of the things here is, you know, we do want to consult people. We will listen to the unions. We will listen to staff. We do think that it's perfectly possible that people will come up with things that we want to adapt or improve about it. But you know, the aim is to bring it in 2025, having done that, and you know, I think we will be able to meet the concerns people are expressing.
Right. Well, that's it from us. Big thanks to John Catt for supporting the show, and a huge thanks to Mark. Mark, thank you so much for coming on this evening and sharing your views. It's been really interesting. Huge thanks, John, as well, for giving up your time this evening.
Yeah, pleasure. Good fun.
Yeah, no, really fascinating to hear the proper insights into this, and I'm sure all our listeners will feel the same way. It's been interesting to hear people's different views on it. Huge thanks as well to Kevin Courtney, who was on earlier on at the beginning as well, for giving up his time to come on. If you want to listen back to this, like, let's imagine like Rob, I'm not targeting you, but I sort of am. Let's imagine you're Rob and you've just joined for the last 2 minutes. Well, don't worry, because it will be available as a podcast via Spotify and Apple Podcasts and all the other places you can get them. Oh, Rob's just run off. Rob, I didn't mean to insult you. Come back. No, he won't. He's gone. But no, seriously though, if you've missed this whole conversation, it'll be available as a podcast. Just search Teachers Talk Radio wherever you get your podcast from. Oh, and if you're feeling kind, drop us a review. You know, I'll tell you what we do. Let me tell you what we do. 80% of our hosts are current teachers, like me, and 80% plus of our guests are teachers or work in schools. So that's what we're trying to do here at Teachers Talk Radio. We're going to keep the live conversation going and try to keep leading the education conversation with conversations like this one. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a lovely evening. I'll be back next Monday night, but if you can't wait that long, we've got shows happening all week. Thanks, everybody, and good night.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.